One of the great things about money is that it can mostly buy you whatever the fuck that you want. But also, one of the great things of what money can't do is that it can't necessarily buy an entire culture, right? Well, barring some examples, but we'll get into that. So, I think instilling a culture of at least of feedback and proper etiquette among teammates goes much further than buying a roster purely on name value. And I harken back a lot to the super teams of any esport, right? With FaZe Clan over in Counter-Strike or KT Rollsters within League of Legends. And it's the idea that you can't just solve your problems by buying the best fucking names within existence and kind of creating them and throwing them in this fucking crock pot and just letting that shit simmer until you get a good meal. I know some of us do that shit as a quick meal, but yeah, I've been on them crock pot recipes. But anyways, the problem I have is I think NA has traditionally imported players without properly analyzing the difference of culture. So when I say this, obviously I'm alluding to the idea of importing Korean players, for instance. It's historically been something that NA has had difficulty integrating into teams and whatnot. Like you look back all the way to maybe Piglet and such, or you even talk about Looper and how they imported him way past his prime, but also just integrating these types of players into the entire culture and not realizing the nuances of said culture. There's been multiple different Korean players that have said that they've just gotten homesick or whatnot. Bang, for instance, is another good player that you can strike towards to where he just actually didn't fit in to the American culture. Think of European players. Let's look back at TSM, right, with Sven and Mithy. That was one of the more recent examples to where, well, Mithy was this very outspoken person, someone who was very brash, very straightforward. Same thing with Sven a little bit. And so you have this disconnect of culture, and it doesn't seem like teams understand that you need to inherently build a culture and develop a culture on a fundamental organizational level to where now teams expect you to act this way or have these expectations of these players. And then when they join that org, you then have players that want to be within that entire culture, right? That's how shit usually works. My most, at least, relevant example within the real world or whatever, right, not just esports, is a difference of eye contact. Eye contact is something that is very important within Western culture, but it means something completely different within Eastern culture, specifically, of course, Japan or Korea. Japan, sometimes eye contact is actually very disrespectful. It depends upon your environment and how you're looking at someone. Same thing within Korean culture. So it begs to differ as to whether these Western cultures or just the Western mindset, especially Americans, for instance, view this other type of mindset of eye contact with that in and of itself, regardless of whether they are within America or not. Like, that should be taken into consideration as to how maybe that Asiatic culture views eye contact itself. And just because they don't give you eye contact, that doesn't mean that they aren't paying attention. That doesn't mean that they don't respect you, and that doesn't mean that they don't have confidence of what they're trying to say or maybe the thoughts that they're trying to convey. It's a very different thing when it comes to the Western mindset versus Eastern mindset of eye contact. That's just one instance of cultural differences and maybe how that might be misconstrued as you cross barriers in that sense. So overall, I think the way that coaches are developing, or rather the angle NA is taking on coaching, is finally going to solve the problem. At least I'm very hopeful of it. because it seems like they are investing more and more upon their coaches. And the one major thing is that they still don't get the concept of developmental coaches versus veteran coaches. I think that's the very large disconnect that seems to happen, and that they don't seem to understand that coaching a veteran is very different from coaching a rookie. For instance, a rookie, it's all about setting up systems. It's all about setting up fundamentals. It's about setting up ways and thoughts about the game. It's also about developing maybe how you should function within a team environment. Maybe they've never played in a team environment before, so you have to kind of introduce them into that. So it's an entirely different culture, and it's like it's like teaching a 101 class, right? Of teaching like 101 of mathematics versus teaching a course of 160 where you're into calculus or something, right? It's a completely different thing. And if you introduce calculus too soon, it's just going to brush over someone's mind, right? It doesn't make any sense to introduce it too early. To go to a more recent example, I think Immortals is one of the coaching staffs or one of the organizations which is actually doing this shit correctly, because I think it's funny because I think the coaching staff probably costs more than the players. Now, I say that as a joke, but I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if that were the fucking case. But point being is that, yeah, I think at least investing within your coaching staff is a very good idea, because it sets your organization up rather than it just sets the players up, right? Like, fuck the players, at least from an organization, right? Like, if you can help the players, cool, but help the organization first, because there really are no players if there are no organizations, right? Because I mean, organizations bring sponsors, they bring all the money, and they have a spot in the league, like all this shit, right? So if you can't feed yourself, then there's no point in trying to feed someone else, right? So you need to take care of yourself. It's like the famous situation of trying to catch someone or save someone who is drowning. It's like, all right, like, you got to make sure to calm them down first and be a good enough swimmer in order to save them, and then you can save them, right? Same shit. So I think Immortals is actually going about the right way to do this, especially since I think they have a very developmental coaching staff and a lot of different rookies and shit. So it makes a lot of sense. So anyways, transitioning to veterans and the veteran aspect and the veteran, I guess, dilemma, and maybe you could make a whole actual shit. I probably might actually do this in the future, of the difference between teaching veterans versus teaching rookies, because there are very large differences, and I don't think esports is counted for this shit at all, which disappoints me a lot. But I mean, we are getting introduced to just coaching in general, so I don't find it that strange that we're so far behind the curve. But it's the idea of managing egos. I think that takes a different stuff of a man. It's completely different coaching style, in the sense that to manage someone's ego, especially of a superstar, you need to be able to tell them, or at least to get them into a way to buy into the system that you have created, right? And you have to do this in a way to which they don't have to sacrifice their ego that much in order to buy into the system, right? Like, they don't have to placate themselves so much of, whatever alpha mentality that they fucking have in order to get into this system, and kind of sacrifice their own shit in order to, I guess, further progress the betterment of the team and the organization. So you need some way to be able to do that. And that takes a different thought process than getting a rookie to buy into a system. So yes, while Team Liquid, TSM, Cloud9, G2, Fnatic can all buy their way into relevancy, they can't buy culture. That's the big fucking thing. And if you're one of these lower organizations, I would bank all into that shit, right? If you don't have the bankroll to do it, well, then create something in which other teams can't buy. Money can't buy culture, as I said, or as the title says. That's also why I think G2 was a very special team. Speaking of which, of a team that can buy shit now, is that they created this dynamic to where, I mean, fuck, even Perks was willing to play ADC. Like, just imagine such a good culture to develop to where a mid laner wants to play ADC. I mean, fuck, you go into solo queue and you have a mid laner and you try and get him to play ADC, he's going to be like, fuck no, I'm not playing that bitch role. Like, what? And wait until 25 minutes until I can do anything in the game? Like, fuck you. So it takes a special kind of organization or a special mindset to instill such a culture within an entire team. So I'll leave you with this gem, at least, that is more applicable from the real world sense and what we've at least gathered from history, is that the best way to change culture is by the perception of empowerment, right? And this is kind of a marketing term or a marketing way, right? Like, and this gets cynical, more and more cynical and more evil as you go down the rabbit hole. So don't go too far into this shit, but it does work if you want to use this. Famously, there was a man called Edward Bernays. Edward Bernays was a famous marketer, famous also just understanding of psychology in general and how to use that. And also, a little tidbit, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the famous psychoanalyst and psychologist. And so Edward Bernays, he developed this idea of torches of freedom. And so this was back in, I want to say that the late 60s, early to mid 70s, to where the feminist movement, the first feminist movement, was well underway, right? And this was when, you know, women within the United States were trying to fight for their rights and everything like that, you know, and very necessary movement, but at the same time tainted by businesses trying to take advantage of that. And well, you can also see some parallels going into the modern day. And so what Ed Bernays developed was this idea of torches of freedom. And now this idea, and I recommend actually, if you guys haven't, well, if you are maybe an enthusiast of history or you just like watching documentaries itself, I recommend this documentary called The Century of the Self. Very, very good. I would say one of my top 3 documentaries of all time. And I've watched a lot of different documentaries. Like, you know, take that with a grain of salt, I guess. Whatever the fuck you want to do with it. Anyways, Edward Bernays developed this idea of torches of freedom. This was, I believe it was during the Macy's parade. Now, if you know the historical relevance of the Macy's parade, this is like a really historical moment within New York City, to where Macy's would partially fund this parade, and you know, it would just be where all these fashion icons and shit, like all these new products or whatever, just would go through New York City and have a float or whatever, and you know, show off whatever the fuck. And so famously, what happened was there were these group of women that were part of the tobacco industry or tobacco campaign, which lit cigarettes and were just walking in the parade. And now the significance of this is that women back in the day, it was frowned down upon for women to smoke, right? It was more of a manly type of thing, right? It's men smoked, and that was more of the cultural norm, right? It was very uncouth for a woman to smoke, you know, and like this was during around the time to where women didn't even really wear pants a lot, right? Like it was like this time to where women only wore dresses or skirts and heels and shit and all that. And, you know, like famously, if you aren't American, at least I assume this is an American terminology, is that, like, who wears the pants in the relationship? That's where that comes from, is because women typically didn't wear pants back in the day, right? So this was like, pants were a sign of, well, yeah, men wear pants, women wear dresses, whatnot. So anyways, Edward Bernays was trying to change this norm, but on more of a cynical basis, in the fact that he realized that that's half of the world population that you're trying to ignore. So why are you ignoring this 50% of a customer base, right? So why not try and latch on to this feminist movement by now saying, oh yeah, women should be more empowered, and they should do that by smoking, right? Why is smoking such a traditionally male trait or a male event? And so they got women smoking, and we all know the hazards of smoking now. But back in the day, people didn't give a shit. So just remember that the best way, as I said before, to have someone buy into a culture is to have them feel like they're empowered by that said culture. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are technically empowered by the culture, but it's the assumption that they feel as though they are empowered by it, right? And so this is a little bit how North American teams should view themselves and how they develop their culture, is how can you feel as though you empower players or you empower people when they're joining your team? And better yet, it's probably better if you actually do empower them. That's probably the less evil way of doing things. But it is also, just noteworthy to realize the way in which something can be used as an abusive way in terms of getting people to feel as though they're empowered, to then know exactly how people can be empowered. So that's just a particular lesson within history. But the most important part is that North American teams need to make sure, or at least make players feel like they are empowered, to then be able to buy into the system of North American LCS.